Hey there, I'm Alex Kidman and this is the HMD Aura 2, a budget phone with a difference. Although whether that difference is worth it or not, well, you'll see. So before I start, a quick ethical disclosure. This HMD Aura 2 was sent to me by HMD Australia for the purposes of review, but it will be going back to them. That's the case for probably 90% of what I review these days, and it has no impact on the review whatsoever. They've had no input into this review. All of these opinions and test results are my own. Now, with that out of the way, the key selling point of the Aura 2 is that it's a low-cost phone. Here in Australia, this runs $169 at launch, and over time we can expect that to drop because Android phone prices drop. $169 puts it firmly into true budget territory, and there you're nearly always talking about compromises. This is true of the Aura 2 as well, although some of those compromises are really rather interesting. So the first compromise for the Aura 2 is with the display screen. 6.52 inches, but just 1280 by 576 pixels, which means this is quite a low resolution screen for a 2025 phone. Definitely well below the par. And at just 460 nits of peak brightness, it's also not super bright. Not great in direct sunlight either. It also feels like it's been a while since I've actually tested a phone with a teardrop style notch at the front, though that's really just a matter of taste as to whether or not you prefer that or hole punch style notches for your front facing selfie camera. For $169, you do at least get color choices. So the model that HMD sent me is the icy blue, but there's also a midnight black variant if you favor that. I like blue phones. I'm on the record as saying I like blue phones. This is reasonable enough, although it doesn't really look or feel premium in any true way. Controls are fairly simple, standard volume rocker and then a combination assistant / power button on the side. I've had relatively few issues with that in terms of unlocking. Most of those thinner power buttons, you do have to have a kind of sweet spot for the strike zone. This is no different to that in any real degree. Like a lot of budget phones, you also get a proper 3.5mm headphone jack if that's important to you. Unlike a lot of budget phones, it actually has an IP water resistance rating, although it's only IP54. Basically, you can get it moist, that's fine. If you go swimming with it, it's going to die. Where the Aura 2 does stand out is that it's part of HMD's commitment to making repairable phones. So full guides on how to repair this phone are available through iFixit, and so are parts, at least in theory. I'll get into that in a minute. So have I smashed up the screen to see how easy it is to repair? Well, in a word, no. Partially because it's destruction porn rather than really serving a purpose, and partially because, in fact, at the time of writing iFixit doesn't actually have the parts to sell. It will sell them here in Australia, but it just doesn't seem to have stock. C'est la vie. But while I think the concept of repairable phones is eminently laudable, and I actually think it's really great that HMD is leading the charge on it, I also kind of feel like, well, this is a $169 phone. It's a budget phone, it's a cheap phone, and I'm not super convinced that the market for this phone is particularly going to bother repairing it, because by the time you're likely to need to repair it, the cost of the Aura 2 is likely to have dropped. It should be some months from now unless you're very clumsy. And then the bridge between how much the replacement parts cost and a brand new phone is not going to be that substantial. I mean, if you had to replace, say, the screen and the battery, including shipping, that's nearly going to be half the price of the phone again. I'm just not super sure that too many people are going to bother with that. And I think that's a pity in a lot of ways, because more phones should be more repairable. And I love that HMD is leading the charge here. I mean, by way of comparison, it's 2025 and Apple in Australia still hasn't made self-repair available for its phones locally. And those are like $2,000 phones. I mean, if HMD can do it for a $169 phone, then Apple should do better. And this isn't a complete digression, really, because I do think that repairable phones are a really smart idea. It is just so much environmentally better to continue using an older product, if you can, than to say, well, I'll just buy a new one when this breaks and send the parts to landfill, even if some of it might be recycled. And so while I think this is laudable in principle, I'm not convinced too many Aura 2 buyers are going to bother in reality. If you have different thoughts, let me know below, because I think there's a fascinating discussion to be had here. On the camera front, this tells a very simple story because it's a very simple camera phone, as so many budget phones are. 13 megapixel at the back, 5 megapixel at the front, and the results are ordinary at best. The worst thing about this, and this is very common for budget phones, is that it's a really slow camera. Slow to launch, slow to focus. Forget taking any fast-moving shots. It's just not going to happen. And even the shots you think might be okay may well not turn out all that well. If you want good photos, look elsewhere. In performance terms, HMD made some really interesting choices when it came to the Aura 2. Not so much on the processor front, standard little cheap Unisoc processor in there along with 4GB of RAM, which isn't high, but again, kind of par for the course for budget phones. But in storage, because this thing comes with 256GB of onboard storage. That's a lot for a budget phone. And it gets even weirder when you consider this also supports microSD expansion, but only up to 128GB. So this might be the only phone I've ever tested that supports storage expansion, but supports storage expansion that's way smaller than the onboard storage of the phone itself. Like I said, some unusual choices there. Though I'm not really going to complain about having more storage available on a phone. What I will complain about is the speed of the HMD Aura 2, because it really doesn't have much of that. The combination of that Unisoc processor and just 4GB of RAM is not one that leads to performance that's anything beyond glacial. And to an extent that's to be expected. This is a budget phone, but still, it doesn't even really compare well against other phones that you can have around this price point or other HMD phones. So to give that some context, here's how it compares using Geekbench 6's CPU test. And admittedly, it's a little bit faster than the Logic L66M, but that's not a fast phone to start with. And it's a very similar story when we look at GPU performance by way of 3D Mark. Now, HMD is clearly aware that it wasn't building a rocket ship when it designed the Aura 2, which is why it runs on Android Go, the version of Android designed for low-power devices. The catch here is that it's Android Go 14, already now 2 Android versions behind, and the promise here is for only 2 years of security updates. Now, lots of budget phones get no particular security update promises, so this is at least something, but it's not much. And the experience of using the Aura 2 is certainly one that's tested my patience, even with Google's own apps that should respect the Android Go platform a little more. To an extent, again, goes with the territory, but when you can get phones that are more responsive than the Aura 2 at this kind of price, I'm not sure why you wouldn't. The HMD Aura 2 packs in a 5000 mAh battery, exactly on par with most other Android phones right now. HMD's contention is that this should be good for up to 50 hours of phone battery life, like really nice long battery life as per their claims. Lots of budget phones running on low power processors can extend out their battery endurance because they're just not doing that much. So is this the Aura 2's secret superpower? Well, not quite. Naturally, battery life will depend on how you use the phone. I've got a full video about how I battery test phones and the limitations of everyone's phone battery testing. But using my standard YouTube battery test as a comparative guideline, while the Aura 2 has performance that suggests a single day's moderate usage should be fine, it does rather peter out after that. Here's how it compares. Now, you also have to bear in mind that, given the limitations of its screen, it's not even pushing out a 720p video there, so it's having an easier processing time than some comparable phones, and that battery life dipping after that first hour isn't encouraging. It's not a great look, and day-to-day usage, yes, you can get a day out of it, but longer than that, that's really pushing it. I don't really see that 50-hour figure as being massively achievable unless you really don't use this phone very much at all. You get no charger in the box, just a simple USB-A to USB-C charger, so you will have to provide your own, and charging is quite slow at just 10 watts, so charging overnight would probably be the go. So should you buy the HMD Aura 2? Well, look, it does have a few unique selling points, even within the constraints of a budget handset. Packing in 256GB of storage at this price is quite remarkable, and producing a phone that's designed to be reasonably straightforward to repair is at least theoretically sound, even if I do have my doubts as to how many people would actually bother. However, that's kind of where the good news for the HMD Aura 2 stops. I can totally accept and respect that budget phones are going to be slow, and there's no doubt a market for people who don't want to spend too much and just need the absolute basics out of a smartphone, and this will do that. It's just that in a comparative market, it doesn't do it any better than other phones. In fact, it does it slightly worse, and that makes it a much harder phone to recommend.